Venturing into the wild can be a thrilling adventure, but it can also turn into a fight for survival. The great outdoors is home to unpredictable wildlife and unforgiving terrain, where even the most experienced hunters can find themselves in life-threatening situations. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters where hunters faced off against fierce predators and harsh environments, testing their skills and their will to survive. From savage grizzly bear attacks to nighttime boar terror, we'll take you on a journey from danger to survival. The remote backcountry of northwestern Montana, stretching across the Continental Divide near the Canadian border, encompassed thousands of square kilometers of pristine wilderness that had remained largely unchanged since the last ice age. The region's rugged topography, carved by ancient glaciers and shaped by millennia of erosion, created a maze of steep valleys, rocky ridges, and dense forests that provided ideal habitat for North America's most formidable predator, the grizzly bear. These massive omnivores, weighing up to 400 kilograms and standing nearly 3 meters tall on their hind legs, had roamed these mountains for thousands of years, developing an intimate knowledge of every trail, water source, and feeding area within their vast territories. The area's complex geology, dominated by sedimentary rock formations dating back millions of years, created unstable terrain where loose shale and hidden boulders posed constant hazards for unwary travelers. Seasonal weather patterns brought intense precipitation during spring and early summer months, saturating the thin mountain soil and creating treacherous, muddy conditions that could persist for weeks after major storm systems. Local wildlife management authorities regularly warned hunters and hikers about the increased dangers of grizzly encounters during autumn months, when the bears entered hyperphagia, consuming massive quantities of food in preparation for winter hibernation. In September 2023, Thorne Kincaid, a 38-year-old outfitter from Great Falls, had been guiding hunting expeditions in Montana's wilderness areas for over 15 years. His extensive knowledge of local terrain and wildlife behavior made him one of the most sought-after guides in the region, though he maintained a healthy respect for the unpredictable nature of grizzly bears during their pre-hibernation feeding frenzy. Kincaid's current expedition focused on tracking a large herd of elk that had been moving through the area, following seasonal migration patterns that would eventually take them to lower elevation winter ranges. The recent weather had been particularly challenging, with a series of Pacific storm systems bringing nearly constant rainfall for the past week. The precipitation had transformed normally stable mountain slopes into slick, treacherous surfaces, where every step required careful attention to avoid potentially fatal falls. Stream crossings became dangerous as water levels rose beyond normal parameters, while game trails turned into muddy channels that retained boot prints and animal tracks for days after passage. On the morning of September 21st, Kincaid had located fresh elk sign along a narrow ridge that offered commanding views of the surrounding valley systems. The herd appeared to be moving toward a known feeding area where late-season grass remained accessible despite the early snowfall at higher elevations. His tracking efforts required him to navigate a particularly steep slope where loose shale and mud-covered rocks created hazardous footing conditions. The slope's gradient exceeded 30 degrees in several sections, forcing Kincaid to rely on small trees and exposed roots for stability as he worked his way across the treacherous terrain. His .300 Winchester Magnum rifle, secured across his back with a tactical sling, provided the stopping power necessary for large game but added weight that affected his balance on the unstable surface. The recent rain had saturated the thin soil layer, causing it to separate from the underlying bedrock and creating conditions where entire sections of slope could give way without warning. As Kincaid carefully picked his way across a particularly challenging section of muddy terrain, following elk tracks that led toward a dense patch of serviceberry bushes, he failed to notice the massive grizzly bear that had been feeding on the same berry patch he was approaching. The bear, a mature male estimated to weigh over 350 kilograms, had claimed the productive feeding area as part of its preparation for winter hibernation. Grizzly bears during the autumn months demonstrated heightened territorial behavior and aggressive responses to any perceived threats to their food sources. The bear's initial reaction to Kincaid's approach was explosive and immediate. The massive predator erupted from the dense underbrush with shocking speed, its powerful muscles propelling its enormous frame across the muddy slope with surprising agility despite the challenging terrain. Grizzly bears could achieve running speeds exceeding 50 kilometers per hour even on level ground, and their ability to maintain traction on steep, muddy surfaces far exceeded that of humans attempting to navigate similar conditions. Kincaid's response was instinctive and immediate. He swung his rifle from his shoulder and brought it to bear on the charging grizzly, his years of hunting experience allowing him to acquire his target despite the adrenaline surge and unstable footing. The .300 Winchester Magnum cartridge he had chambered possessed sufficient power to stop a charging grizzly bear with proper shot placement, though the challenging conditions made accurate shooting extremely difficult. His first shot, fired from a distance of approximately 20 meters, was aimed at the bear's chest cavity, where it would have the greatest chance of inflicting immediately fatal damage. However, the bullet's trajectory carried it directly into a moss-covered boulder that had been concealed beneath a thin layer of mud and vegetation. The high-velocity projectile struck the rock's surface at an angle, causing it to ricochet with tremendous force while fragmenting into multiple pieces that scattered across the surrounding area. The ricochet sent rock fragments and bullet fragments spraying in multiple directions, several pieces striking Kincaid across his chest and shoulder with enough force to tear through his hunting jacket and create deep lacerations in the muscle tissue beneath. Blood immediately began flowing from the wounds as the impact threw him off balance on the already precarious slope. His footing gave way completely as the muddy surface provided no purchase for his boots, and he began sliding toward the edge of a shallow ravine that bordered the steep slope. The bear's charge continued unabated despite the gunshot and flying debris. Its massive claws, each measuring over 10 centimeters in length, raked across the muddy surface as it pursued its perceived threat down the unstable slope. The animal's weight and power allowed it to maintain control on terrain where Kincaid struggled simply to avoid falling, demonstrating the grizzly's superior adaptation to the challenging mountain environment. Kincaid's slide toward the ravine edge accelerated as the saturated soil offered no resistance to his movement. His attempts to arrest his fall by grabbing exposed roots and small trees proved largely unsuccessful as the muddy conditions made maintaining any grip extremely difficult. The approaching ravine, while not deep enough to prove immediately fatal, contained numerous sharp rocks and fallen timber that would inflict serious injuries on anyone who fell into it with significant force. The grizzly bear's pursuit brought it within arm's reach of Kincaid as both man and animal struggled to maintain control on the treacherous slope. The bear's claws scraped against the muddy surface inches from Kincaid's legs, while its massive jaws snapped at the air as it attempted to close the remaining distance. The animal's hot breath and distinctive musky odor filled Kincaid's nostrils as he fought desperately to escape the predator's reach. In desperation, Kincaid managed to roll himself behind a fallen log that had come to rest across the slope, providing temporary protection from the bear's continued assault. The dead tree, a massive Douglas fir that had probably fallen during a recent storm, measured over 60 centimeters in diameter and provided substantial cover despite being partially buried in accumulated mud and debris. From his position behind the log, Kincaid attempted to chamber another round in his rifle while maintaining visual contact with the circling grizzly. The bear's behavior indicated continued aggression and territorial defense rather than simple curiosity, suggesting that it would not abandon its attack unless convinced that the threat had been eliminated or had withdrawn from its territory. Kincaid's second shot achieved better results, striking the bear in the shoulder and creating a substantial wound that finally convinced the animal to reassess the situation. While not immediately fatal, the injury caused sufficient pain and disruption to interrupt the bear's single-minded focus on destroying the perceived intruder. The grizzly's retreat was gradual and deliberate rather than panicked, indicating its continued readiness to resume the attack if circumstances changed. The bear's withdrawal into the dense forest cover provided Kincaid with his first opportunity to assess his own injuries and plan his extraction from the dangerous slope. The ricochet wounds across his chest and shoulder required immediate attention to prevent excessive blood loss, while his precarious position on the unstable terrain demanded careful movement to avoid triggering additional mudslides or falls. Kincaid's eventual self-rescue required over 2 hours of careful climbing and first aid treatment before he reached stable ground and could contact emergency services. The encounter left him with permanent scars and a renewed respect for the lethal combination of dangerous wildlife and treacherous terrain that characterized Montana's wilderness areas during challenging weather conditions. In the autumn of 1994, the fog-shrouded fields of rural Romania near the town of Brașov presented a landscape that seemed frozen in time, where traditional farming methods still dominated and wild boar populations had grown substantially following political changes in the region. The Carpathian foothills created natural corridors for wildlife movement, and local farmers had reported increasing crop damage from nocturnal boar raids throughout the harvest season. This particular area had maintained its agricultural character for centuries, with small family farms scattered across rolling terrain that provided perfect cover for large game animals seeking easy food sources. Matei Ionescu, a local hunter from a nearby village who had been tracking wild boar for nearly 15 years, received permission from frustrated landowners to reduce the population that had been devastating their potato and corn fields. The experienced hunter knew that wild boars were most active during nighttime hours, particularly when fog provided additional cover for their foraging expeditions. Romanian hunting traditions emphasize patience and intimate knowledge of animal behavior, skills that Matei had developed through countless nights spent in the countryside. The evening had begun with typical autumn weather, but as darkness settled over the region, an unusually thick fog began rolling in from the nearby valleys. This meteorological phenomenon, common in the area during late October, reduced visibility to perhaps 20 feet in most directions and created an almost supernatural atmosphere across the farmland. The moisture-laden air muffled sounds, making it difficult to determine the direction and distance of any movement through the fields. Matei had positioned himself near a weathered wooden fence that separated two agricultural plots, knowing from previous scouting that boar regularly use this area as a travel route between feeding locations. His headlamp, a relatively new piece of equipment for rural Romanian hunters at the time, provided a narrow beam of illumination that barely penetrated the surrounding mist. The 12-gauge shotgun he carried had been inherited from his father and had proven reliable for close-range encounters with aggressive game. The massive wild boar appeared suddenly in the fog, emerging from what seemed like empty space directly ahead of Matei's position. The animal was clearly a mature male, weighing what the hunter estimated at over 300 pounds, with prominent tusks and the muscular build that made the European wild boar so formidable. The beast's reaction to the sudden appearance of bright light was immediate and violent, transforming from a cautious forager into an enraged predator within seconds. Matei fired his shotgun quickly, managing to graze the boar's left shoulder with the spread of pellets, but the wound only seemed to increase the animal's fury rather than deterring its attack. The boar charged directly at the hunter, covering the distance between them with surprising speed despite its bulk. The impact sent Matei crashing backward into the wooden fence post, which had been weathered by decades of Romanian winters and summers. The collision drove splinters into Matei's back, while the boar's tusks found their mark, tearing deep gashes across his right arm and left side. The wounds immediately began bleeding profusely, mixing with the mud and moisture that covered everything in the foggy field. Pain shot through his body as he struggled to maintain consciousness and keep the animal from inflicting more serious injuries. The hunter managed to scramble to his feet despite his injuries, though the combination of blood loss and shock made his movements unsteady on the slick ground. The boar had backed off slightly after the initial attack, but remained close, circling him with obvious hostile intent. Its breathing was labored from the shotgun wound, and steam rose from its body in the cold night air, creating an even more menacing appearance in the fog. Nearby farm dogs, apparently awakened by the commotion, began barking frantically from several different directions. The cacophony of sounds seemed to confuse and distract the wounded boar, giving Matei precious moments to locate a broken fence post that could serve as an improvised weapon. The piece of wood was perhaps 3 feet long, with a jagged end where it had snapped, hardly ideal for confronting an enraged wild boar, but better than facing the animal empty-handed. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity, though it probably lasted no more than 5 minutes. The boar made several feints toward the injured hunter, but the continued barking of dogs and the presence of the makeshift weapon seemed to give it pause. Finally, the animal turned and disappeared back into the fog as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the sound of its movement through the wet grass to mark its departure. Matei remained alert for another 20 minutes, listening for any indication that the boar might return, before finally beginning the careful journey back to his vehicle. The experience had taught him that night, hunting in fog created conditions where even experienced hunters could find themselves at a severe disadvantage against wounded game animals. In the summer of 1999, Montana's Bitterroot Mountains remained one of the most pristine wilderness areas in the northwestern United States, where black bear populations had recovered significantly following decades of conservation efforts. The rugged terrain, characterized by steep ridges and dense coniferous forests, provided ideal habitat for wildlife while presenting challenges for backcountry hunters willing to pack deep into roadless areas. This particular region had earned respect among local outdoorsmen for both its trophy elk populations and its healthy predator numbers, including black bears that had grown increasingly bold around human camps during drought years. Thorne Kincaid, the same experienced Montana hunter who had survived his grizzly encounter 12 years earlier, planned a father-son hunting expedition with his 22-year-old son, Tobias Harlan, who had recently graduated from college and wanted to experience the challenging backcountry hunting that had shaped his father's outdoor philosophy. The younger man had hunted extensively in more accessible areas but had never ventured into the remote wilderness where proper camp management and wildlife awareness could mean the difference between a successful trip and a dangerous encounter. The violent summer rainstorm had developed unexpectedly during their third night in the mountains, transforming what had been a pleasant camping experience into a test of their equipment and preparation. Lightning illuminated the forest canopy while thunder echoed off the surrounding peaks, creating a dramatic backdrop that masked other sounds moving through the wilderness. Their camp, established in a small clearing beside a seasonal creek, had seemed well positioned during daylight hours but now felt exposed and vulnerable. The massive black bear that approached their tent was drawn by the scent of elk meat they had harvested 2 days earlier and stored in what they believed was a secure location. The animal, weighing approximately 400 pounds and displaying the confident behavior typical of bears accustomed to raiding human camps, had apparently been monitoring their activities for some time before making its move. The combination of heavy rain and wind had masked its approach until the moment it made contact with their shelter. The bear slammed into the tent with enough force to collapse one side of the structure, its claws easily tearing through the waterproof fabric that provided their only protection from both the storm and the wildlife. Tobias, sleeping on the side where the bear made initial contact, found himself suddenly exposed to the animal's attack. The bear's massive paw swiped across his chest and right arm, its claws cutting through his sleeping bag and clothing to open deep lacerations that immediately began bleeding heavily. Thorne, awakened by his son's shouts and the sound of ripping fabric, grabbed his .306 rifle from where it lay beside his sleeping bag. The confined space and poor visibility made accurate shooting nearly impossible, but he managed to fire a round that grazed the bear's left shoulder. The wound was not serious enough to incapacitate the animal, but the muzzle blast and sudden noise seemed to increase its aggression rather than driving it away from the camp. The enraged bear spun toward the source of the gunshot, knocking over their backpacks and scattering camping supplies across the muddy ground. Cooking equipment, clothing, and food containers mixed with rainwater and blood as both men scrambled to escape the collapsing tent. The bear's jaws snapped dangerously close to their faces as they rolled away from the destroyed shelter, seeking any available cover in the storm-lashed clearing. Rain continued to pour down, mixing with the blood from Tobias's wounds and creating treacherous footing on the already slippery ground. The father and son managed to grab improvised weapons from their scattered gear, including a camp hatchet and a large cooking pot that might serve to distract the animal. The bear continued to investigate their ruined campsite, apparently still interested in locating the stored meat that had originally attracted its attention. The standoff continued for nearly 10 minutes, with the bear periodically approaching their position behind a fallen log, while they maintained defensive positions with their makeshift weapons and remaining ammunition. The animal's behavior suggested it was more interested in claiming their food supplies than in continuing its attack on the humans, though its unpredictable movements kept both men on edge. Finally, the combination of the gunshot wound, the persistent storm, and the defensive behavior of its intended victims convinced the bear to abandon its raid on their camp. The animal disappeared into the rain-soaked forest, leaving behind a scene of destruction that would require hours to address properly. Their tent was beyond repair, most of their equipment was scattered and damaged, and Tobias required immediate first aid for his injuries. The experience taught both men that even experienced backcountry hunters could find their camps vulnerable to determined wildlife, and that proper food storage techniques were essential for safe wilderness camping, particularly during weather conditions that might drive hungry animals to take greater risks around human habitations. In the early autumn of 2003, Colorado's high-elevation hunting grounds faced unusual weather, with fog and moisture replacing the clear, crisp air typically expected during elk season. The jagged peaks and narrow ridgelines of the wilderness acted as natural funnels for both wildlife and weather, causing sudden shifts in visibility and conditions. At the same time, local biologists reported heightened mountain lion activity, linking it to the drought that had driven their prey into higher elevations. Rowan Kincaid, Thorne's younger brother and an accomplished hunter from Colorado Springs, had planned an elk hunting expedition with his 19-year-old son, Tobias, who shared the family name but was actually Rowan's child rather than Thorne's. The younger man had recently completed his first year of college and was eager to prove himself capable of handling the challenging, high-altitude hunting that had become a family tradition. This particular area required technical climbing skills and careful route finding across loose rock formations that could prove treacherous for inexperienced mountaineers. The father and son team had been tracking a magnificent bull elk for 2 days, following the animal's sign across increasingly difficult terrain as it led them higher into the mountains. The elk's route had taken them along a narrow ridge composed primarily of loose scree, fractured stone fragments that shifted underfoot and created the constant threat of small avalanches. This type of terrain demanded careful movement and absolute attention to foot placement, particularly when carrying hunting rifles and heavy packs. The fog that rolled in during their third day of hunting transformed the already challenging environment into something approaching a nightmare scenario for mountain hunting. Visibility dropped to perhaps 10 feet in most directions, while the moisture made the loose rock even more unstable and dangerous. Sound became muffled and distorted, making it nearly impossible to determine the direction of movement or the distance to potential hazards. The mountain lion's ambush came without warning, as the animal had apparently been stalking them from above for an unknown period. Mountain lions were known for their ability to move silently across difficult terrain, and this particular cat had chosen its attack position with the calculated patience that made these predators so successful. The animal launched itself from a concealed position among the shadowed rocks, targeting the younger member of the hunting party with predatory precision. Tobias took the full impact of the mountain lion's initial attack as the animal's claws shredded through his hunting jacket and opened deep cuts across his left shoulder and upper back. The force of the impact knocked him off balance on the unstable scree slope, setting off a small cascade of loose stones that created additional hazards for both hunters. Blood immediately began flowing from the wounds, mixing with the fog moisture and creating slippery conditions on the already treacherous rock surface. Rowan managed to bring his .306 rifle to bear on the attacking mountain lion, though the close quarters and poor visibility made precision shooting extremely difficult. His shot succeeded in grazing the animal's right flank, opening a wound that drew blood but failed to incapacitate the powerful predator. The mountain lion's reaction to being wounded was to increase its aggression rather than retreat, demonstrating the dangerous unpredictability of cornered wildlife. The injured mountain lion lunged toward both hunters, forcing them to scramble across the loose scree in an attempt to reach more defensible positions. Tobias, weakened by his injuries and shocked by the sudden violence of the attack, lost his footing and tumbled approximately 15 feet down the slope before managing to arrest his fall. The young man's landing opened additional cuts on his right leg, where sharp rock edges tore through his clothing and skin. Rocks continued to tumble around both hunters as their movements destabilized the slope, creating a chaotic environment where the mountain lion's natural advantages were partially offset by the dangerous terrain. The predator circled their position with obvious hostile intent, its low growling barely audible through the fog, but clearly indicating its continued threat to their safety. The animal's eyes reflected what little light filtered through the mist, creating an unsettling presence that seemed to materialize and disappear as it moved. Rowan managed to reach his injured son's position and drag him behind a large boulder that provided some protection from both the mountain lion and the continuing rockfall. From this defensive position, they waited while the predator continued to pace around their location, apparently weighing the risks of pressing its attack against the potential rewards of claiming its prey. The standoff lasted nearly 20 minutes before the mountain lion finally decided that the combination of its own wound, the unstable terrain, and the armed humans made continued aggression inadvisable. The animal disappeared into the fog as silently as it had appeared, leaving only the sound of shifting stones to mark its departure. Both father and son remained in their defensive position for another 15 minutes before beginning the careful process of treating Tobias's injuries and planning their descent from the dangerous ridge. Having learned that mountain hunting required constant vigilance against predators that could appear without warning in conditions where human advantages were severely compromised. In the autumn of 2007, northern Minnesota's dense birch forest near the Canadian border provided prime habitat for one of North America's largest and most unpredictable game animals during the peak of rutting season. The region's vast wilderness areas, characterized by interlocking wetlands, thick timber stands, and numerous beaver ponds, created ideal conditions for bull moose seeking to establish dominance and attract mates. Local wildlife officials had warned hunters that aggressive behavior among bulls reached dangerous levels during this period, particularly when the animals felt cornered or surprised by human presence. 3 experienced hunters from Duluth had obtained permits for what they hoped would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to harvest a trophy bull moose in this remote wilderness area. Jack Thompson, a veteran outdoorsman with over 30 years of hunting experience, led the expedition along with his longtime hunting partners, Ethan Parker and Luke Morrison, both skilled hunters who had pursued various game species across the upper Midwest. The trio had spent months preparing for this challenging hunt, knowing that success would require patience, physical endurance, and careful coordination. Recent rainfall had transformed the normally manageable forest floor into a treacherous maze of slippery roots, fallen branches, and hidden obstacles that could easily cause serious injuries to unwary travelers. The moisture had also enhanced the forest's natural sound dampening qualities, making it difficult to hear approaching wildlife until animals were dangerously close. These conditions demanded extra caution from hunters who needed to move quietly while maintaining awareness of their surroundings. The massive bull moose they encountered represented everything they had hoped to find during their expedition, standing nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder with an impressive rack of antlers that spanned over 5 feet across. The animal's behavior, however, immediately indicated that it was in full rut and prepared to defend its territory against any perceived threats. Bull moose during rutting season were known for their unpredictable aggression and their willingness to charge anything they considered a challenge to their dominance. The hunters had been carefully stalking through a dense stand of birch trees when the bull suddenly appeared ahead of them, apparently as surprised by the encounter as they were. The animal's massive head swung toward their position, and its body language immediately shifted from cautious alertness to obvious aggression. Steam rose from its nostrils in the cool morning air, and its antlers were positioned in a threatening manner that experienced hunters recognized as a prelude to attack. Jack raised his .300 Winchester Magnum quickly, managing to fire a shot that grazed the bull's left shoulder, but failed to inflict serious damage on the enormous animal. The wound only seemed to increase the moose's fury, and it charged directly toward the three hunters with the devastating power that made these animals so dangerous during encounters with humans. The sound of its hooves pounding against the wet ground created a drumming rhythm that seemed to shake the forest around them. Ethan Parker, positioned slightly ahead of his companions, took the full force of the bull's initial charge as the animal's massive body slammed him against a fallen birch tree with bone-crushing impact. The moose's broad antlers raked across his torso and legs, opening deep gashes that immediately began bleeding profusely, while the impact broke several of his ribs. The force of the collision drove splinters from the dead tree into his back and shoulders, adding to his injuries. Blood began soaking into the muddy ground as Jack and Luke scrambled to assist their wounded companion, while avoiding the continued threat posed by the enraged moose. The animal had backed off after its initial attack, but remained close to their position, pawing the ground and displaying clear signs of continued aggression. Its breathing was labored from the gunshot wound, but the injury was not serious enough to significantly impair its ability to continue fighting. The bull moose circled their position for several minutes, occasionally making short charges toward the hunters that forced them to take cover behind available trees and fallen logs. Each movement sent waves of pain through Ethan's injured body, but his companions knew they needed to keep him mobile if they hoped to escape from the animal's territory safely. The moose's unpredictable behavior made it impossible to predict when it might launch another full attack. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of tension, the bull moose turned and crashed away through the forest, apparently satisfied that it had driven the intruders from its domain. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footsteps gradually faded into the distance, leaving the three hunters alone with the serious problem of getting medical attention for Ethan's injuries in a location that was several miles from the nearest road. Jack and Luke carefully assessed their companions' wounds, determining that, while serious, they were not immediately life-threatening if proper first aid could be administered and evacuation arranged promptly. The process of moving him through the difficult terrain toward their vehicle required careful planning and considerable physical effort from both uninjured hunters. The experience taught all three men that even experienced hunters could face life-threatening situations when encountering large game animals during peak aggression periods, and that successful wilderness hunting required not only skill and preparation, but also the ability to work together effectively under extreme stress. In the late summer of 2011, Alaska's Kodiak Island presented unique hunting opportunities for those willing to navigate its challenging terrain and face the largest brown bears in North America. The island's coastal environment, characterized by dense spruce forests, salmon-rich streams, and fog-shrouded valleys, supported a thriving ecosystem where Kodiak bears had evolved to reach massive proportions. Local hunting guides frequently warned visitors that these animals could exceed 1,000 pounds and displayed territorial behavior that made them extraordinarily dangerous when surprised or threatened. Lucien Ortega, an experienced hunter from Anchorage, had planned a caribou hunting expedition with his 24-year-old son Emil, who worked as a wildlife photographer and possessed extensive knowledge of Alaskan fauna. The father-son team had chosen to use all-terrain vehicles to access remote hunting areas along the island's coastal trails, equipment that provided mobility advantages but also created noise that could mask the approach of dangerous wildlife. Their route followed traditional paths used by both hunters and local residents to navigate the island's challenging geography. The thick fog that enveloped the coastal trail during their hunting expedition was typical of Kodiak Island's maritime climate, where warm ocean currents met cold air masses to create persistent, low-visibility conditions. This meteorological phenomenon could last for days at a time, transforming familiar landscapes into alien environments where even experienced outdoorsmen could become disoriented. The fog also provided perfect cover for wildlife movement, allowing large animals to approach within dangerous proximity before being detected. The colossal Kodiak bear that emerged from the dense spruce forest represented the apex of North American predators, a mature male that likely weighed close to 1,000 pounds and stood nearly 10 feet tall when rearing on its hind legs. The animal's sudden appearance directly in front of their moving ATV indicated that it had been traveling along the same trail, possibly heading towards salmon, spawning areas that provided critical feeding opportunities during the late summer season. Lucien swerved violently to avoid direct collision with the massive bear, sending their ATV sliding sideways on the muddy trail surface. The machine's tires lost traction on the slick ground, and despite his efforts to regain control, the vehicle flipped onto its right side with sufficient force to throw both riders clear of the wreckage. The sound of twisted metal and breaking plastic mixed with the bear's aggressive vocalizations to create a cacophony that echoed through the fog-shrouded forest. Emil landed hard on a collection of jagged rocks that lined the trail's edge, suffering cuts across his left shoulder and right leg where sharp, stone edges tore through his hunting clothing. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs and left him temporarily stunned, unable to immediately assess the full extent of his injuries or respond to the continuing threat posed by the enraged bear. Blood began flowing from his wounds, mixing with mud and debris scattered by the ATV crash. The Kodiak bear, rather than fleeing from the mechanical disruption of its travel route, became increasingly aggressive and began investigating the overturned vehicle with obvious hostile intent. The animal's massive claws scraped against the ATV's metal frame as it attempted to determine the source of the disturbance. Its jaws snapped dangerously close to Lucien's position as he struggled to extract himself from beneath the partially overturned machine. Lucien managed to grab his .338 Lapua Magnum rifle from where it had been secured to the ATV's frame, though the weapon had sustained damage during the crash that made its reliability questionable. With the bear positioned only a few feet away and showing clear signs of continued aggression, he had no choice but to attempt a point-blank shot at the animal's massive torso. The rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed forest environment, and muzzle flash illuminated the fog surrounding their position. The shot succeeded in grazing the bear's left flank, opening a wound that drew blood but failed to incapacitate an animal of such tremendous size and power. The Kodiak bear's reaction to being wounded was to increase its aggressive behavior rather than retreat, demonstrating the dangerous unpredictability that made these animals so feared by experienced Alaskan hunters. The creature's roar seemed to shake the surrounding trees and reverberated through the fog-filled valley. Both father and son found themselves in an extremely precarious position, with Emil still recovering from his injuries and Lucien trapped partially beneath the overturned ATV with limited mobility. The bear continued to circle their location, occasionally approaching close enough that they could hear its heavy breathing and see its eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the fog. The animal's behavior suggested it was evaluating whether to press its attack or withdraw from the confrontation. The standoff continued for nearly 15 minutes, during which time both men remained as motionless as possible while monitoring the bear's movements around their position. The combination of the gunshot wound, the mechanical noise and confusion of the crash, and the defensive behavior of its intended targets eventually convinced the massive predator to abandon its aggressive behavior and disappear back into the fog-shrouded forest. After waiting another 20 minutes to ensure the bear had truly departed, Lucien and Emile began the process of assessing their injuries, evaluating the damage to their equipment, and planning their extraction from a location several miles from any potential assistance. The overturned ATV had sustained significant frame damage that made it impossible to operate, while their emergency radio had been crushed during the crash, eliminating their primary means of communication with the outside world. Emile's wounds required immediate attention to prevent infection in the humid coastal environment, where bacterial contamination posed serious risks to open cuts and abrasions. Lucien used their first aid supplies to clean and bandage his son's injuries while mentally calculating the distance they would need to travel on foot through challenging terrain to reach their base camp. The fog showed no signs of lifting, which would make navigation extremely difficult without familiar landmarks to guide their route. The experience had demonstrated that Kodiak Island's reputation for dangerous wildlife encounters was well-deserved, and that even experienced hunters using modern equipment could find themselves in life-threatening situations when massive predators chose to assert territorial dominance. The incident would later serve as a cautionary tale among Alaskan hunting guides about the importance of maintaining situational awareness and having backup emergency plans when venturing into remote areas inhabited by North America's largest land predators. Both men realized that their survival depended entirely on careful movement through unfamiliar terrain while avoiding additional encounters with the island's formidable bear population. Having learned that mechanized hunting could become deadly when massive predators decided to defend their territory,